Ladies and gentlemen, seekers of light and secret knowledge wherever you may be, you are listening to Points of Light Radio, the podcast dedicated to taking you past the apron and behind the closed doors of lodges everywhere. And here is your host, Stan Miller.
How are you? Folks, this is the second segment of Points of Light Radio. And as you heard in the introduction, this is the podcast that is dedicated to taking you inside the lodges of secret societies everywhere. Now, in this segment, I'm going to be keeping you in the loop of the kind of progress I've made, lining up interviews and looking for your feedback, as well as some other areas of the podcast. First of all, in the last segment, I thought I'd raise this first, actually. In the last segment, I asked about the definitions of secret societies and asked what exactly these secret societies did, what they were all about, whether they were as dangerous as some said they were, or whether they were fairly benign. Well, you, the listener and viewer, seem to understand that better than to some of the people I was approaching for interviews, because it seemed to have spooked a lot of them. Okay. Now, if you watched and listened carefully, as I'm sure you did, you would have heard me tell my listeners and viewers to leave their tinfoil hats off, and preferably at the door on their way in. For the record, Points of Light is not a conspiracy type podcast. Okay. As I said before, other podcasters are covering that angle. On a second note of on a note of housekeeping, I also pointed out that I would steer clear of the Freemasons for the time being. For the record, and I'm going to say this again, this podcast is not anti-Masonic. In fact, as part of this note of housekeeping, I also want to mention that I may be looking at some of the appendant bodies, shall we say, of Freemasonry. And I have put out some requests for interviews from some of them: Order of the Secret Monitor, the Royal Arch, possibly the Templars. Just get a feel for what's out there with the Freemasons. But I've received mixed messages from some of our friends in the Oddfellows. I had a very terse reply from two local lodges. I'm going to let that go. I mean, yeah, but, and and obviously it doesn't speak for all Oddfellows, because I've also received a very friendly and welcoming message from one of the provincial Grand Lodges of the Oddfellows. So I'm encouraged about that. The Elks and Moose Lodges, as well as the Pythians, I've had some very receptive messages, return messages to my request for interviews from them. And I will be interviewing the Pythians, I know for sure, in the near future. So interviews will resume shortly. But the questions from my last segment remain unanswered. I'm still puzzled that the first organization that comes to mind when people hear the term fraternal society is Freemasons. Like, why is that? And why do the Freemasons seem to be the primary beneficiaries of movies like Angels and Demons or National Treasures? You know, why are not some of the other storied fraternal organizations, not benefiting from these kinds of movies? And why are these storied fraternal organizations losing members and closing lodges? Right? Are the millennials not the men and women their parents were, as dedicated to these types of organizations? I don't know about you, but I do want to know. what goes on behind the closed doors of these lodges. These lodges, and I was asked by one of the people I requested an interview from what I was trying to do here on Points of Light Radio. I think one of the things I'm attempting to do, as well as seek out some light, is to maybe preserve some of the history of these storied organizations. We all know, I've said this before, we all know that many of the signatories of the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. We know that. But we don't know that, for instance, in Canada and other parts of the world, the Freemasons also signed documents just like that. How come we don't know about that? Right? And many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence in the United States and the Constitution, the signatories of the Constitution, also belong to many of the other fraternal organizations, but you don't hear about that. Why is that? This is part of our nation's history. These organizations are part of world history, and I think it's worth preserving some of that history, don't you? Right. And I keep saying this, I would love to interview not only members of these lodges, but their leaders, but they need to step up and talk. They really do. I think you'll agree with me. They need to step up and talk. And as I've said, the questions remain unanswered. And there is still light and knowledge to pursue, and I think it's worth pursuing, don't you? Now, before I leave you, I want to draw your attention to some things here. This podcast is available on both YouTube and Spreaker. Please share, like, and subscribe when viewing Points of Light Radio on YouTube. I also welcome your comments and input. In the details section of this podcast, you can see that Points of Light is also available on Spotify. You can follow Points of Light on my Facebook page. My Twitter feed is at PO Light Radio. You can also see the link to the Points of Light Radio store. I've actually ordered some merch that I will be showcasing here from my store that I will be showcasing here with each segment of Points of Light Radio. I will also point out that if you have a store that sells fraternal merchandise of any kind, I'm available to advertise that merchandise. But I don't know about you. I'm not prepared to give up so easily. I've got interviews lined up. So get your welding goggles on. I really do believe you're going to need them, because it's going to get really bright in here as we go along on Points of Light Radio. So let's go. Let's explore. Let's learn. And let's seek out some light. Until next time, folks, all the best.